Vic Cotroni, the one-time master architect of Montreal's underworld. For half a century, his corruptive power reaching the highest levels in society.
Hey, can I help you, sir?
Lieutenant Latraverse.
Lieutenant, there's someone here to see you. It's Vic Cotroni.
It was said he had his hand in everything, but his fingerprints nowhere.
Mr. Cotroni.
Come to you for a favor.
Come to my office.
His grip could once be measured on a global scale, but now he comes hat in hand to the police.
I can help you. But in return, you need to help me. I need to know about your world. From the beginning.
An extraordinary life shrouded in secrecy. Only he holds the key to Montreal's underworld. In 1924, the port of Montreal was the gateway of this Babylon city on the St. Lawrence.
Montreal is a great city. It's a large city. It's a vibrant city. It's a city where the founding fathers wanted to be alive, to be vibrant, to have a certain quality that attracted nightlife. So what immediately evolved, of course, is brothels, speakeasies, blind pigs, wild nightclubs, and that, of course, attracts criminals of a higher order.
Ideal for what's become the bootlegging capital of North America. It is prohibition, and Montreal is quenching the thirst of a dry continent.
During the 1920s, when prohibition reigned in the United States, all kinds of American tourists came to Montreal to imbibe freely, and it was a very lively city compared to the rest of the country, which was gray and solemn.
To the shores of this Sin City arrives the Cotroni family. Eldest son Vic quickly takes to the new world.
Vic Cotroni came to Canada with his family as a young man. I think he was 14, and settled in Montreal. He was a street-smart kid. He could spot an opportunity quite easily and move in to take it.
Montreal's dockyards run night and day to keep pace with the multi-million-dollar bootlegging industry. A young Vic joins the workforce, running booze into the States.
Come on! What's taking you guys so long?
You're killing us. He's weighed a ton.
Hey, who's this new kid?
I don't know, he's amazing.
What's his name?
It's, Cotroni, that's it.
Cotroni.
Yeah, I think probably his energy, probably his brains, probably, or what connected him to someone named Armand Courville, who was a very, very colorful character, kind of the P.T. Barnum type of guy.
Hey, Cotroni. Come here for a minute. I'm Armand Courville. You ever wrestled before?
No.
Come here.
Courville introduces Cotroni to the world of professional wrestling, one of the hottest sports in Montreal during the 30s. Vic Cotroni quickly catches on. His stage name, Vic Vincent.
Vic Cotroni, despite his short stature, was a stocky guy, but if he had shown up on a midget card, it wouldn't have been surprising, really. It showed that he was a pretty tough guy because he was fighting the full-size wrestlers.
But Courville sees something more in Vic. He could use him outside the ring. A little muscle to help manage his other interests.
Vic Cotroni was the perfect fit as an enforcer with his background, the rough and tumble world that he was involved in, gambling, bootlegging, beating up people for debts and things. He was threatening, but he was also very cool. He had this aura about him.
Well, that's what you want. Okay, it's a little lower because there's nobody here. Right? It's just not the right time of the year. Come on, guys, I got no more money. You know, it's just slow. You got to understand. Right. You got to come. Well, that's to pay the bills. It's the commission. Oh, come on. You're not going to take all of that.
Vic Cotroni was a gangster of the streets. He started off as a thug. He was a strong-arm man. He filled a need.
Oh, look. Come on. You got to leave me with some. Come on.
Don't mess with me.
By the end of the 30s, he had grown from being a minor bootlegger to a so-so professional wrestler to a real up-and-coming criminal.
By the 1930s, Vic partners with Courville to wrestle a greater slice out of Montreal's many vices. Corrupt police and politicians are essential to safeguard underworld operations. During elections, Vic is first through the door, making sure every vote counts. A common practice, baseball-backed electioneering.
Various parties hired ruffians called goons, and they would attack sometimes a polling booth. They'd burst into a polling booth and stuff false ballots into the box, and thus distorting the vote completely.
Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Shut
what are
up.
you doing?
Just
You
shut
can't.
up.
What are you doing?
Shut up!
Nothing, all right? Nobody saw nothing. Stuff the boxes.
There was a lot of violence, a lot of heads being broken between the various parties. It was very rough and very corrupt, and that was the electoral system.
Nothing. Nobody saw nothing. Nothing. Especially you. Nothing. Got it? Stuff it. Come on, come on, come on. Can't do that. Nothing. You saw nothing. Got it?
They came up from the wrestling to political organizing, which wasn't that big of a leap because a lot of the organizing involved beating up people at the polls or convincing people to vote in the right way.
With results guaranteed, politicians are now in place who will allow the rackets to flourish. An early lesson in politics for Vic Cotroni.
The future wasn't in bouncing people around a ring. The future wasn't getting into bigger crime. The future wasn't connecting with politicians. And by the end of the 1930s, that's where Courville and Cotroni were.
Come on, Cotroni, let's go. Get in there.
Vic Cotroni is moving up in the underworld, earning the respect of those around him. As for Vic Vincent, he will soon be sidelined for good.
What's the matter? Do get in here with some water. Oh, my star.
A severe injury ends Vic's career as a hands-on enforcer.
I think Vic understands that the best way to establish his authority and to stay during a long period is to act with using his brain.
Over the next 2 decades, Vic will refine his position in the underworld. He will control a number of the city's hottest nightclubs. The perfect front to build an underworld empire. Vic Cotroni has come a long way since his bootlegging days. He is now one of the most successful nightclub owners in Montreal.
In the 40s and in the 50s, the nightclub business in Montreal was thriving. We had nightclubs galore. I mean, downtown, every street corner had a nightclub.
Everywhere in the world and in history, you know, the mobsters loves and needs nightlife. And after the Second World War, many nightclubs was operated by Cotroni's brothers, especially Vic Cotroni.
Vic's most popular club, the Faison Doré, has become his base of operations.
Vic controlled maybe 4, 5, 6 clubs, personally.
So it's just
And they were the best of clubs. So he was the man. He was the man.
It was the most famous place in Montreal and probably in Canada and one of the most in North America at that time. Judges, politicians, journalists, policemen, businessmen, everybody go to the Faison Doré.
Vic Cotroni made his reputation with all ranks of society by being the owner of a nightclub, and it gave an air of respectability to Cotroni. And he was rubbing elbows with those people every night. It was quite suave in that respect.
These cafes were very popular at the time because they attracted a lot of popular seniors from France. And also this place attracted another type of people. Marseille gangsters and Corsican traffickers.
So the Faison Doré was the headquarters for the mafia. It was the place for of Vic Cotroni.
As Vic glad hands the city's elite, brothers Frank and Pep work the darker side of Montreal's nightlife, allowing Vic the illusion of respectability.
Throughout his life, he really used his brothers to insulate himself, to do his bidding. So, for instance, you had Pep Cotroni, his brother, that was the drug specialist. You had Frank Cotroni, that was the muscle, the enforcer. And then you had Vic Cotroni. I don't do drugs. I don't handle drugs. I don't do that enforcement work. I'm not muscle. I'm not strong arm. And he could say it almost without lying.
Pep's visitors tonight are European drug smugglers looking for a safe pipeline into the U.S.
Pep, being Italian, speaking French, had good connections with the Marseille people. The Italians in New York couldn't do that in Marseille because they didn't speak the language. The best heroin in the world came out of Marseille. So that's why they became the big connection between New York and Marseille.
These men strike a deal. With the Cotroni's help, Montreal will become key to the U.S. drug trade. The French heroin starts flowing.
Vic Cotroni did very well in Montreal. By the 50s, he was getting into drugs, and so much that New York took notice. The mob in New York, the Banana family, They needed Montreal for the drug flow. So Joe Bonanno sent up Carmen Galante.
Carmen Galante was at that time the underboss of the Bonanno family. He was a very powerful figure in New York City.
No, Galante was reputed to have 80 murders on his credit, so he was a mean bastard.
Carmen Galante saw the immense profits that were available both through Montreal as a city and also through Montreal as a transit point for heroin.
Carmen Galante's here. Your buddy Galante's here. Relax.
You think that hurts? Look at me. You ever spill a drink in front of me again, I swear to you, I will put a gun to your head and blow your brains out. You got that? Look at me. Say you're sorry.
Sorry.
Say you're sorry, Mr. Galante.
Sorry, Mr. Galante.
Get out of here before you cause a scene.
Everything okay, Mr. Galante? Things go a little crazy around here sometimes.
When Carmen Galante was making moves on Montreal, he very quickly figured out who was of importance there. It did not take long for Vic Cotroni to come to his attention.
I think Carmen Galante would have been drawn to Vic Cotroni for a lot of reasons. He's a very efficient manager. He was strong. He could use muscle, but he also hit a lot of politicians in his stable.
Galante likes what he sees. Vic knows the city and has all the right connections. Soon an alliance is formed between New York and Montreal.
Carmen Galante came up and ran the Bonanno family out of Montreal with Vic Cotroni. Vic Cotroni was very flexible, very adaptable. He worked very, very nicely with Galante.
The two become fast friends and cement their bond with a time-honored mafia tradition. They will stand as godfather to each other's children. But their close tie is cut short in 1955.
There came a time when Carmen Galante could no longer stay in Canada. Police reports from the United States were tipping off the Canadians to who he really was. So Carmen Galante was eventually deported.
Suddenly, the Bonannos no longer have their top man in Montreal.
Carmen Galante and the Bonanno family faced a dilemma here. Either they turned their back on Montreal, or they found someone who was from Montreal who could run it on their behalf.
Vic is entrusted with protecting New York's interests. But the police do not stop at Galante. They hound his close associate, Frank Trula, the mob's frontman, for bribes and blackmail.
Take the money! Take the money! Just don't touch the book! Take the money! Oh, please! Please! Oh.
So we went to search Trula. And that's where we found $18,000 in U.S. currency. And they had a list there. So we looked at the list, and they had, on the list, the first thing he had was the chief of police, the chief of homicide, and chief of holdups. And so much a month. He shook in his boots.
He made the mistake of putting things down in writing, a lot of things about who was corrupt, who wasn't. There were a lot of payoffs going to politicians, going to police, and Petrula was organized, but he couldn't keep it all in his head.
We've never seen Petrula since. He must be at the bottom of a river. In those days, it was popular to tie a cement block in the legs of these people that they want to get rid of, and I suspect that's what happened to him. We never see him after. Never.
Petula's list endangers Vic's operation.
When the list of who's being paid off and how much was published became known, and that all of a sudden just fueled a reform movement, which is the sort of thing, if you're an organized crime, you absolutely don't want.
Montreal's newly elected mayor, Jean Drapeau, will use this information to fight corruption in the city.
He was the great reformer. He was going to clean up Montreal in the late 50s. He was going to get rid of the drugs and get rid of the gangs and the power and the nightclubs and the prostitution and everything else.
Brothels, nightclubs, and gambling dens are shut down. Even City Hall and the streets are swept clean.
As the brothels and the late-night bars and the gambling houses, one by one, were cleaned up in 1955-56, one writer said, "The old lady has lost her girlish laughter. Montreal would never be the same."
Jean Drapeau has become a hero to many in the community, but not to all. With his crackdown grinding the underworld's operations to a standstill, the new mayor has made a powerful enemy in Vic Cotroni. It's 1956, and Vic Cotroni's operation has been hit hard over the last 2 years. Montreal Mayor Jean Drapeau is making good on his promise to clean up the city. The underworld turns to the one man who might help them.
By the late 50s, Cotroni had a lot of respect on the street in Montreal, and with legitimate people. And he had a huge stature. He ran nightclubs, he ran a lot of the underworld activities, and he was in a perfect position to take on this reform movement of Drapeau.
Drapeau's 1957 re-election campaign promises even tougher reforms and an attempt to completely wipe out corruption. But Vic is ready.
The mob are very angry, so they are very well involved in the political election. For the mobster, this election was a key election to restore their situation, their business.
Vic Cotroni was the master corrupter. He was able to corrupt anyone, and I mean anyone. And if he couldn't, he knew somebody who would. It's the old underworld saying, if you don't know the guy, then you should know the guy who knows the guy.
Vic invests in a $1 million war chest to help defeat Drapeau's candidates. Those he can't buy off will be intimidated to stay away from the polls.
I invite all the citizens of Montreal who have the right to vote to get out and vote.
Election Day, October 28th, 1957. A travesty for democracy.
But the goon squad will concentrate on those polls, baseball bats and what have you, to scare the electors away.
They all raided each other's committee rooms. They all bribed people to vote. They bought vote and so on. And there was a lot of strong-arm influence of the old mob that wanted to get back in.
The chief returning officer complained about that. And he's the one that was kidnapped, taken into an alleyway, and ran over his legs. They broke his legs. That was Dr. Ruben Levesque. I still remember the name.
This is a day few Montrealers will forget. With 17 wounded in gunfights and an uncounted number of beatings, the results are all but assured.
Drapeau lost the 1957 election, and was terribly indignant, and he felt that the winner had won by unfair means.
Well, I think people in Montreal got used to not being surprised. You know, there was so much corruption going on. The mob got reorganized, and they were able to steal the elections.
Business good, Mr. Cotroni?
That's some crazy election we had.
The hope of the underworld was things could open up again, and they did. Everything was well organized. The machine was beautifully oiled.
Once Cotroni helped to get rid of the reformer Drapeau and his party, he gained a lot of power and prestige in the city. People owed him a lot.
I think Vic Cotroni was a kind of hero in the mob and a kind of model also for the leader in the mafia families.
Now secure in his position as Montreal crime boss, Vic makes more time for a very private second life.
Like a lot of mobsters, Vic Cotroni had a mistress on the side, and one very special mistress who he loved most of his life. And he had a son. He named him after his father, who he loved dearly, Nicodemo, actually.
But this safe haven from the outside world is about to unravel.
Vic Cotroni was very discreet his entire life, but in the early 60s, Maclean's did this 5-part series on the mafia, and there was a whole article on Cotroni's empire in Montreal. They called him the Godfather of Canada, but he felt that he was so insulated that they couldn't prove it in court, so he sued.
In an uncharacteristic move, Vic publicly challenges the magazine in a high-profile lawsuit.
We call this man the Godfather of Canada.
Godfather of Canada, Your Honor, this man has an impeccable record. This is an insult.
Your client's reputation speaks for itself. The settlement will stand.
He had been libeled. His reputation had been unfairly attacked, but then when they assessed his reputation, they figured it was only worth $1. It
was a huge mistake to sue Maclean's. The reason he sued Maclean's was that he felt they couldn't get him. He was so insulated, he had so many political connections, but he was wrong.
An embarrassing setback. The trial even uncovers Vic's lover and son. This only makes Vic more determined to expand his influence.
I think the root of his power was his ability to reach out into civic politics and corrupt, into provincial politics and corrupt. Some people say into federal politics. I have no reason to doubt that.
Vic turns to the blackmail of elected officials.
He was very well connected to some prostitutes who were very well connected to some politicians, which was a very powerful lever to have. Gerda Munsinger, she was in the organized crime entertainment wing, and a lot of her clients, people she was friendly with, were politicians.
Pierre Savigny, a senior member of parliament, is caught in the mob's honey trap.
Gerda Munsinger was just an absolutely huge embarrassment. She had done enough that when accusations came out that she had bedded some really senior people in Ottawa, it was a huge scandal.
Pierre Savigny's political career is ruined.
I am not going to defend myself, no. I shall attack with every means that the law puts at my disposal and others to find out who is at the source of this infamous language.
What it really showed was the power of Vic Cotroni, that he makes people buffoons, he makes them laughing stocks. If he shot them, it would have been merciful, really.
As Vic settles into his position as boss of Montreal, the Bonanos in New York are not faring as well.
Joe Bonanno, the founding father of the Bonanos, had really sort of overstepped his bounds in New York, had offended the other bosses. He was being forced out. But throughout this turmoil, the Bonanno family wanted to hold on desperately to Montreal. They realized that was the key. linking the Mafia of America and the Mafia of Europe.
Rival crime boss Buffalo Stefano the Undertaker Magaddino looks to take advantage of the Bonanno's weakness. He makes a play for Montreal. A mob war looms. Vic calls for a sit-down, sure he can defuse the situation.
To resolve this issue, the question of whether Montreal should belong to the Bonanno's family, there were several meetings held in Canada, in Hamilton and Montreal, to resolve this question.
Vic offers a compromise. He will accept into the heart of his family a rising young star in the Magaddino organization, Paolo Violi. Buffalo is satisfied. Vic's diplomatic touch raises his stock within the mob. A growing number of visiting mobsters now seek his advice. In 1968, police tail a fugitive wanted by the FBI. It leads them to his mistress's apartment. Vic is not arrested, but his son sees it all. He vows never again to put the boy through such an experience.
Vic didn't want his son to be corrupted. So he sent his girlfriend and his son to live in Florida and to study in Florida. He wanted a better life for his son.
He will shield the boy, and just in time, Vic may not survive the coming danger. Vic Cotroni has reigned over Montreal's underworld for over 20 years. But the 1970s will finally shine a permanent light on his life in the shadows.
It's amazing, really, when you look at the longevity of Vic Cotroni, someone who's active in the underworld in the 1930s, and then you fast forward 4 decades, and he's still major player in Montreal, to the point that the FLQ named him in their manifesto.
The FLQ singles out Vic Cotroni as the election rigger, the puppet master, pulling the strings of government.
He was seen as actually a symptom of all that was wrong in democracy, really. You know, this is the guy who makes the elections meaningless. This is the guy who turns democracy into organized crime. He was seen as the absolute sign of all that was wrong in Quebec by people who were trying to totally change the political structure.
The FLQ and their disruptive activities of bombings and killings is something that Vic Cotroni didn't approve of, because it interfered with business, and nothing should interfere with business.
October 1970, and the FLQ strikes. Kidnapping government minister Pierre Laporte and British diplomat James Cross leads to the War Measures Act, paralyzing a nation.
At a key moment during the October crisis, the Cotroni family offered to fine Pierre Laporte after he'd been kidnapped by the FLQ for the authorities. The Cotronis weren't taken up on that, but they hated the radicalism and the revolutionary activity of the FLQ.
By November, the crisis subsides, but the Montreal boss remains uneasy. Now in his 60s, Vic makes plans for the future of his organization. He gathers his lieutenants for an important meeting.
It came time for Vic Cotroni to basically name his number 2.
He looks for the mobster best suited to lead his street operations. Vic gives the nod to the man who has, over the years, earned his trust. Paolo Violi.
It was a controversial move. Paolo Violi, as a bit of an outsider from Montreal, didn't have the organization in place that, say, the Rizzutos had.
Nick Rizzuto leads a powerful crew within the Cotroni organization. Their expertise, drugs. He is surprised with Vic's choice.
Niccolo Rizzuto was frustrated, and Niccolo Rizzuto was looking for his chance to take the lead in Montreal.
Very well respected, very powerful. The reputation was well known. Everybody knew that you don't fuck with Nick Rizzuto.
But Rizzuto respects Vic Cotroni. He will wait, convinced his day will come. Vic is no longer safe in the shadows. One investigative reporter will follow up the accusations made by the FLQ.
When I start with Leatherworks, I discover some important relationship with some important people. Some of these people are very well connected with the mafia and local politicians. At that time, because you cannot say this guy is a mafia guy, because it was very difficult legally, I make links.
The publicity forces the province to convene a formal inquiry, the Quebec Crime Probe.
They don't like that. One day, May 1st, 1973, decide to stop me.
Chabourneau? Oui, c'est moi.
This attack only confirms the need for the Quebec Crime Probe.
In the early 70s, the Quebec government launched a crime probe that was modeled very much on some of the American experiences of public exposure of the problem of organized crime. At first, it was largely dismissed by the gangsters as a public relations affair. You know, if they had real evidence against us, they'd charge us. The mere fact that they're trying to embarrass us in front of the television cameras proves that they don't have any evidence.
The Quebec Crime Probe was so important because it put the lights on the underworld.
Vic Cotroni is the inquiry's star witness.
The Quebec Crime Probe, I think Vic Cotroni could have ridden through it if he was a younger man. It came when he was getting up in years.
He simply ignores the court's authority.
He wouldn't say a thing. If you want to send me to prison for the rest of my life, I'll go. And this is why he was respected by all.
Vic is charged with contempt and sentenced to a year in prison. Released in 1975, he is faced with a delicate situation. The Rizzutos are attempting to start their own heroin pipeline into New York. For Violi, it's simple. He wants Rizzuto dead. But this is not Vic's way.
The Rizzuto organization was a power in itself. They had tremendous manpower. They had tremendous street presence.
Vic knows that a split in the family will result in war. His counsel, a sit-down to resolve their differences. Violi and Rizzuto will meet many times, but no deal.
It was a problem for Vic Cotroni. It was a challenge to his decision. It was certainly a problem for Paolo Violi. It was a problem for the Rizzutos because they had people standing in their way of taking Montreal. And it was also a problem for the Bonanno family and the mafia in New York City. This peaceful moneymaker from Montreal was all of a sudden at risk. You had Paolo Violi and Vic Cotroni lamenting to New York, come settle this dispute. We have Paolo Violi traveling to Sicily to talk to the godfathers that have some sway with the Rizzutos. Vic Cotroni tried desperately to settle it through peaceful means. He'd been, of course, successful for decades. I think he felt that he could handle this one as well through talking. But the challenge this time was not one that could be settled through words. I mean, this was a challenge that had to be settled through victory or death.
The Rizzutos act first, taking out Violi's two brothers and a trusted advisor.
One of his key lieutenants was killed when he went to a Cotroni-owned theater that was showing the Italian language version of The Godfather. Then the Violis are killed off, the Violi brothers, the second tier of the Cotronis are killed off one by one.
Finally, Vic Cotroni's hand-picked underboss and successor, Paolo Violi, is killed.
The stakes were far too high to allow anyone, much less Paolo Violi, to stand in the way. We're talking about $1 billion heroin pipeline here.
Even Vic's friend and Bonanno family ally, Carmine Galante, is caught up in the dispute. A victim of the war over control of New York City's drug trade.
He saw the writing on the wall. He knew what was at play here. He saw the changes in New York. He saw the changes right under his nose. He attended the funerals, all of his men. If that doesn't bring home the truth, nothing will.
His crime family in ruins, Vic Cotroni has lost control over Montreal. Weak and vulnerable, he awaits his fate.
The Sicilians were always respectful of Vic Cotroni. They never went against him. They never, ever tried to force themselves and go against Vic, because he was considered to be a man of honor.
The Rizzutos begin their reign over the city. The old boss is spared.
If Vic Cotroni had been killed, I think the meltdown, we'd still be feeling it today, decades later.
From bootlegging's lowest rung to boss of one of the most important centers of organized crime in the world, now age and illness have caught up to Vic Cotroni. He has been diagnosed with cancer.
I got a phone call from Vic Cotroni, and he said, Mr. Latravers, I'm an old man. Before I die, I would like to see my son in Florida. And he says, could you arrange it for me to go there, because I'm not allowed to go in the States.
Mr. Cotroni.
Come to you for a favor.
Come to my office.
Well, I said, could be arranged, but it's going to cost you big time. He says, I'm ready to do anything to go see my son. But I said, one of the things that we will want is to sit down with you and question you.
Look, I will help you. But isn't it time you talk about your life?
You ask too much. My son is in Florida. I simply wish to visit.
When we started with the hard questions about the different murders and the different involvements of peoples, he said, I can't answer these questions.
At least tell me about Montreal. Who controls it now?
I'm sorry. It is not our way.
Then I can't help you.
Look, this is not the deal that we have going here. If you want to see your son, you have to answer all the questions. He says, Mr. Latravers, because he always called me Mr. Latravers. Mr. Latravers, I cannot answer that. This next line of questions, I see where you're going with this, and I can't answer that. Well, I said, Vic, you will die before you see your son in Florida. Well, he says, this is how it's going to be then.
Vic Cotroni is no longer the puppet master. His son Nicodemo drifts into a life of crime, and he is powerless to stop it. A lifetime of secrets will follow him to his grave. On September 8, 1984, Vic Cotroni becomes one of the few mobsters to ever die peacefully in his sleep.